Before we begin this incredible true story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our best emotional stories. Your support means everything to us. Now, let's dive into this amazing tale. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Thomas Mitchell stood at his post, his red uniform pristine, his black bearskin hat perfectly positioned. He had been a royal guard for 8 years, and in all that time, he had never wavered from his duty. His face remained expressionless, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Tourists gathered around him, taking photos and making jokes, but Thomas never flinched. This was his job, his honor, his life. Thomas came from a military family. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and now he carried on the tradition. Being a royal guard was not just about standing still and looking impressive. It required intense training, unwavering discipline, and a deep sense of duty. Thomas had endured months of preparation to earn this position, and he wore his uniform with immense pride. On this particular Tuesday morning, the crowds were larger than usual. A state visit was scheduled for the following week. Tourists from around the world had arrived early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the preparations. Thomas had been on duty since 6 in the morning, and he would remain at his post until noon, when his replacement would arrive. His legs ached, his back was stiff, but he showed no sign of discomfort. That was the mark of a true professional. Across the city, police officer Derek Hayes was having a difficult morning. He had joined the Metropolitan Police 5 years ago with dreams of making a difference, protecting people and upholding justice. But lately, things had changed. The job had become more about paperwork than patrol work, more about politics than protection. Derek felt underappreciated and overlooked. His last 3 requests for promotion had been denied, and he was growing bitter. Derek had always been ambitious. He wanted recognition, respect, and advancement. He looked at other officers who seemed to get promoted easily and wondered what he was doing wrong. His colleagues told him he was too aggressive, too confrontational, but Derek saw it differently. He thought he was simply being assertive, taking charge, showing leadership. The truth was somewhere in between. Derek had talent and dedication, but he also had an ego that often got in his way. That morning, Derek was assigned to patrol the area around the palace. It was a routine assignment, one he had done dozens of times before. Usually it was uneventful, just walking the perimeter, checking for suspicious activity, and occasionally giving directions to confused tourists. But today, Derek was in a foul mood. His supervisor had criticized him again that morning, suggesting he needed to work on his people skills. The comment had stung, and Derek was looking for a way to prove himself. As Derek approached the palace gates, he noticed the crowd gathering around Thomas. People were laughing, taking selfies, and some were getting quite close to the guard. Derek saw an opportunity. If he could manage the crowd effectively, keep order, perhaps even identify a security issue, it might reflect well on him. He pushed through the tourists, his hand resting on his belt, his badge visible. Thomas noticed the police officer approaching but kept his gaze forward. He was used to police presence around the palace. They worked together, each with their own responsibilities. The royal guards protected the palace and the royal family, while the police maintained public order in the surrounding areas. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and clear boundaries. Derek reached the front of the crowd and stopped directly in front of Thomas. He looked up at the guard, noticing how the morning light caught the golden buttons on his uniform. For a moment, Derek felt a twinge of something he did not want to acknowledge. Was it jealousy? These guards got all the attention, all the photos, all the admiration, while police officers like him were often ignored or even criticized. A tourist. A middle-aged woman with an American accent tapped Derek on the shoulder. She asked if she could touch the guard's uniform for a photo. Derek saw his chance to assert authority. Instead of politely explaining the rules, he turned to Thomas and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. These people want to know if they can get closer for photos. You need to be more accommodating. Public relations, you know? Thomas did not respond. He was not supposed to engage with anyone unless there was a direct threat. His orders were clear. Remain silent, remain still, remain professional. Derek interpreted the silence as disrespect. His face reddened slightly. He stepped closer, now just inches from Thomas. The crowd began to sense tension and grew quiet, phones still recording, but conversation dying down. "I'm talking to you," Derek said, his voice harder now. "When a police officer addresses you, you respond. I don't care what your little ceremonial rules say." Still Thomas remained silent. His jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that he had heard the officer's words. Inside, his mind was racing. He knew this situation could escalate, but his training was clear. Do not break protocol. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Derek felt his anger rising. Here he was, a real officer who dealt with real crime, being ignored by someone who just stood around all day looking fancy. He made a decision that would change everything. He reached out and placed his hand on Thomas's arm, gripping the red fabric of his uniform. I said, "I'm talking to you." The moment Derek's hand touched the uniform, everything shifted. Thomas's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead, moved downward to look at the officer's hand on his arm. The crowd gasped. Several people stopped recording, sensing they were witnessing something that might not end well. A supervisor from inside the palace gates had noticed the commotion and was already walking toward them. What happened next would be talked about for weeks to come. Thomas looked down at the hand gripping his uniform sleeve. In his 8 years as a royal guard, no one had ever dared to touch him while he was on duty. Tourists occasionally got too close, but they were quickly redirected by supervisors or fellow guards. But this was different. This was a police officer, someone who should understand boundaries and protocol. Deliberately making physical contact, the palace supervisor, Captain Williams, arrived at the scene within seconds. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and a stern expression that had been refined over 30 years of military service. Captain Williams had seen many situations during his career, but this one troubled him immediately. A police officer touching one of his guards was not just inappropriate. It was a violation of established protocols between their organizations. "Officer, please remove your hand from the guard," Captain Williams said firmly, but professionally. His voice carried authority without aggression. Derek turned to face the captain, but he did not immediately release his grip on Thomas's arm. "I'm addressing a situation here." This guard refused to respond when I spoke to him. Captain Williams stepped closer, positioning himself between Derek and Thomas. "The guards are under orders not to engage with the public while on ceremonial duty. This is standard protocol that has been in place for decades. I'm sure you're aware of this." The crowd had grown larger now. People sensed drama and pulled out their phones, recording every moment. Social media would soon be flooded with videos of this confrontation, though no one knew it yet. The tourists whispered among themselves, some taking sides, others simply excited to witness something unusual. Derek finally released his grip but stood his ground. "I'm a police officer. When I give an instruction, I expect it to be followed. I don't care about ceremonial protocols." Captain Williams remained calm, though inside he was calculating the best way to defuse the situation. He had dealt with difficult personalities before, both in the military and in his current role. He recognized Derek's type immediately, a person who felt overlooked and was trying to establish dominance in the wrong way. "Officer, I respect your position and your authority in matters of public safety. However, the Royal Guards operate under different regulations. If you have concerns about crowd control or security, I'm happy to discuss them. But physically touching my guard while he's on duty is not acceptable." Derek's face flushed red. He felt embarrassed, especially with all the cameras pointed at him. Instead of backing down gracefully, his pride pushed him forward. "Are you telling me how to do my job? I've been a police officer for 5 years. I know what I'm doing." Thomas remained perfectly still, though his mind was working through everything happening around him. He wanted to speak up, to explain that he had done nothing wrong, that he was simply following orders. But his training held him in place. A royal guard does not break position unless there is a genuine threat. This was uncomfortable, even humiliating in some ways, but it was not a threat. Captain Williams took a deep breath. "I'm not telling you how to do your job, officer. I'm informing you of our protocols. Just as you have procedures you must follow, so do we. Perhaps we can discuss this more privately, away from the crowd." This was a diplomatic offer, a way for Derek to save face and step away from the situation. But Derek was too worked up to see it as the gift it was. He saw it as condescension, as someone trying to quiet him down and brush the issue aside. "No, we're going to sort this out right here, right now," Derek insisted. "This guard showed me disrespect and I want an explanation." A senior police sergeant, Martin Cooper, had been notified of the situation and arrived just as Derek made this declaration. Sergeant Cooper was everything Derek was not: experienced, calm, and widely respected. He had worked in the area for 15 years and had an excellent relationship with the palace security team. When he saw Derek confronting Captain Williams, his heart sank. "Hayes, what's going on here?" Sergeant Cooper asked, his tone making it clear he expected a reasonable explanation. Derek turned, slightly relieved to see his supervisor, but also nervous. "Sergeant, this guard refused to respond when I addressed him. I was simply trying to ensure proper cooperation between our departments." Sergeant Cooper looked at Captain Williams, then at Thomas, who still stood perfectly still, and finally at the crowd of tourists with their cameras. He understood the situation immediately. He had worked with the Royal Guards many times and knew their protocols inside and out. He also knew Derek's history of confrontational behavior. "Captain Williams, I apologize for this disruption," Sergeant Cooper said sincerely. "Officer Hayes is correct that cooperation between our departments is important, but I believe there may have been a misunderstanding about ceremonial guard protocols." Captain Williams nodded appreciatively. "I understand, Sergeant. These things happen. Perhaps we can move past this." But Derek was not ready to let it go. "Sergeant, with respect, I don't think this should just be swept under the rug. There's a principle here about authority and respect," the crowd murmured. Some people were clearly on Derek's side, thinking the guard should have at least acknowledged the police officer. Others understood the tradition and felt Derek was out of line. The videos were already being uploaded, and within minutes, people online were beginning to debate who was right. Thomas finally received a subtle signal from Captain Williams, a small gesture that told him he could stand at ease. Thomas shifted his position slightly, a relief after holding rigid for so long. But he still did not speak. He would let his superiors handle this. Sergeant Cooper pulled Derek aside, speaking in a lower voice but still audible to those nearby. "Hayes, the Royal Guards have specific orders not to engage while on duty. You know this. We've been briefed on it multiple times. You cannot expect them to respond to casual conversation." Derek's frustration boiled over. This isn't about casual conversation. This is about respect for law enforcement. We're out here every day dealing with real problems while they stand around looking pretty for tourists. The words hung in the air. They were harsh, dismissive, and deeply insulting to Thomas and every Royal Guard who took their duty seriously. Captain Williams's expression hardened. Sergeant Cooper closed his eyes briefly, knowing this situation had just become much more complicated. Thomas, who had remained silent through everything, felt something shift inside him. He had endured insults from tourists, jokes about being a statue, and countless indignities that came with the job. But hearing a fellow service member, someone who should understand duty and honor, dismiss his role as merely standing around looking pretty, that cut deep. The confrontation was no longer just about protocol or miscommunication. It had become something more personal, more painful, and far more difficult to resolve. The words Derek had spoken echoed through the courtyard. Several tourists looked uncomfortable, while others nodded in agreement. The debate about the value of tradition versus modern practicality was one that many people had opinions about. But for Thomas, standing in his red uniform with his rifle at his side, those words were more than an opinion. They were an attack on everything he had worked for. Captain Williams stepped forward, his diplomatic approach shifting to something firmer. "Officer Hayes, I must ask you to retract that statement. The Royal Guards are highly trained soldiers who have served in active combat zones around the world. Many of them have risked their lives for this country. Their ceremonial duties here are just one small part of their service." Derek scoffed, immediately regretting it but unable to stop himself. I'm sure they're very brave when they're allowed to move and speak. But right now, we're talking about someone who wouldn't even acknowledge a direct question from a law enforcement officer. Sergeant Cooper had heard enough. He grabbed Derek's arm firmly and began leading him away from the crowd. That's enough, Hayes. We're leaving now. But Derek pulled his arm free. No, Sergeant. I'm not going to be dismissed like I did something wrong here. I was trying to do my job and I was disrespected. If this was any other citizen, we'd be having a very different conversation. Thomas felt his jaw clench. He had remained silent for so long, followed every rule, maintained every standard. But there was a limit to what any person could endure. He took a small step forward, breaking his rigid stance for the first time since the confrontation began. Permission to speak. Sir Thomas said, his voice directed at Captain Williams. Captain Williams hesitated. Allowing Thomas to engage could escalate the situation further. But the young guard deserved the chance to defend himself and his fellow guards. Permission granted. Thomas turned to face Derek directly. The movement was precise, controlled, and carried the weight of military discipline. When he spoke, his voice was calm but filled with emotion that had been building for the past several minutes. Officer, you say we stand around looking pretty for tourists? Let me tell you what we actually do. Before I was assigned to this post, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I watched friends die protecting people they never met. I've carried injured soldiers through gunfire. I've spent nights wondering if I'd see another morning. The uniform I wear isn't a costume. It's earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the traffic noise from the nearby street seemed to fade. People stopped recording and simply listened. This was no longer entertainment. This was real, Thomas continued, his words measured but powerful. When we stand at these posts, we represent something bigger than ourselves. We represent history, tradition, and service. We don't respond to every person who wants to chat because we're on duty, protecting the royal family in this palace. Just like you have protocols you follow, we have ours. Respecting that isn't about ego. It's about understanding that different roles require different approaches. Derek stood frozen. He had not expected this. He had pictured the guard as someone who simply followed orders without thinking, someone who was more symbol than substance. Hearing Thomas speak, seeing the conviction in his eyes, Derek suddenly realized he had badly misjudged the situation. Sergeant Cooper watched his officer carefully. He had seen this moment before, the instant when someone realizes they have made a serious mistake. The question was whether Derek would have the character to acknowledge it or the foolishness to double. Down Captain Williams added his voice to support Thomas. Our guards train for 18 months before they can take this position. They study military history, weapons handling, and ceremonial procedures. They maintain physical fitness standards that exceed most military requirements. And yes, they learn to stand perfectly still for hours, which requires more mental and physical discipline than most people can imagine. This is not an easy job, and it's certainly not just for show. An elderly man in the crowd wearing a military veteran's cap spoke up. I served in the Royal Navy for 20 years. These young people in these uniforms are soldiers first. They've earned every bit of respect they get. Several other people in the crowd nodded or murmured agreement. The tide of public opinion was clearly shifting against Derek. Videos that were being uploaded were already receiving comments, most of them critical of the police officer's behavior. Derek felt his confidence crumbling. He had come here wanting to prove himself, to show authority, to demand respect. Instead, he had revealed his own ignorance and insecurity. The cameras that he had barely noticed before now felt like spotlights, exposing his mistakes for the world to see. Sergeant Cooper recognized that this was the moment to end things. Officer Hayes, I think it's time we return to the station. We have paperwork to complete about this incident. The mention of paperwork made Derek's stomach drop. An official report meant this would go on his record. His supervisors would review it. It could affect his career prospects even more than his previous issues had. He looked at Thomas, at Captain Williams, and at the crowd of disappointed faces. I apologize, Derek said quietly, the words difficult to form. I was wrong. I didn't understand the protocols, and I let my frustration get the better of me. Guard Mitchell, you've served your country honorably, and I should have recognized that. It was not a perfect apology. It did not erase what had happened. But it was genuine, and that counted for something. Thomas nodded once, a small acknowledgement that he accepted the words. Even if the hurt remained, Captain Williams extended his hand to Sergeant Cooper. "Thank you for handling this professionally, Sergeant. I trust we can put this behind us and maintain the good relationship between our organizations." Sergeant Cooper shook his hand firmly. "Absolutely, Captain. I'll ensure this doesn't happen again." As Derek walked away with his sergeant, the crowd began to disperse. Tourists went back to their sightseeing, though many continued discussing what they had witnessed. Thomas returned to his post, resuming his rigid stance, his face once again expressionless. But inside, he felt shaken. The confrontation had forced him to break protocol, to speak when he should have remained silent, to show emotion when he should have remained neutral. Captain Williams approached Thomas once the area had cleared somewhat. "You handled that well, Mitchell. I know it wasn't easy." Thomas kept his eyes forward. "Thank you, sir. Will there be consequences for speaking without proper authorization?" Captain Williams smiled slightly. "Sometimes the rules need to bend a little. You defended yourself and your fellow guards with dignity. That's exactly what I would have wanted you to do." But as Thomas stood at his post for the remaining hours of his shift, he could not shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. The videos were spreading online. People were taking sides. The story was growing beyond the simple confrontation between two service members, into something much larger. What Thomas did not know was that someone in the crowd had recognized Derek from a previous incident. Someone who had a story to tell about the police officer's behavior. And that story was about to make everything much more complicated. Sarah Jenkins had been standing in the crowd during the entire confrontation. She was a journalist for a local news website, though she had come to the palace that day simply as a tourist with her daughter. When she saw Derek Hayes confronting the royal guard, her professional instincts kicked in. She recorded the incident on her phone, but more importantly, she recognized the police officer. 3 months earlier, Saray had written a story about police misconduct in the borough where Derek worked. A young man named Marcus Thompson had filed a complaint alleging that an officer had used excessive force during a routine traffic stop. The officer's name had been withheld from the public report, but Sarah had sources within the department. That officer was Derek Hayes. As Sarah watched Derek walk away with Sergeant Cooper, she made a decision. This was not just about one confrontation at the palace. This was about a pattern of behavior that needed to be exposed. She called her editor immediately. By that evening, Sarah's article was published online. The headline read, "Police officer involved in palace guard confrontation has history of complaints." The story detailed Derek's previous incidents, including the allegation from Marcus Thompson, 2 other complaints about aggressive behavior during arrests, and his repeated failures to receive promotion due to what supervisors called poor interpersonal skills. The article went viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with opinions. Some people defended Derek, arguing that police officers face difficult situations every day and deserve support. Others condemned him, seeing the palace incident as proof of a larger problem with how some officers treat people he sees beneath them. Derek saw the article on his phone as he sat in his small apartment that evening. His hands trembled as he read each word, each detail of his career failures laid out for the world to see. He felt exposed, humiliated, and furious. How had a simple confrontation at the palace turned into this? How had his entire career become public gossip? He called Sarah's news office, demanding to speak with her. When she answered, his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "You had no right to publish my personal employment information. I'm going to file a complaint. This is harassment." Sarah remained professional. "Officer Hayes, everything in my article is factual and based on public records and confirmed sources. You became a public figure when you confronted that guard in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras. The public has a right to know about officers who have multiple complaints against them." Derek wanted to argue, to threaten legal action, to make her take it all back. But he knew she was right. The information was public. His actions had made him newsworthy. There was nothing illegal about what she had done, even if it felt deeply wrong to him. At the palace, Thomas was unaware of the growing storm around the incident. He had finished his shift, changed into civilian clothes, and gone home to his flat. He lived alone, preferring the quiet after the noise and crowds of his duty. He made dinner, watched some television, and tried not to think about the confrontation, but his phone kept buzzing with messages. Fellow guards sent him links to videos of the incident. Friends and family called to check on him. His mother, who was still worried about him despite his military service and capable adulthood, called 3 times to make sure he was all right. When Thomas finally looked at social media, he was shocked. The videos had been viewed millions of times. People were discussing him, analyzing his response, debating whether he should have spoken up sooner or stayed silent longer. Some praised his restraint and dignity. Others thought he had been too passive, that he should have put the police officer in his place immediately. The attention made Thomas uncomfortable. He had never wanted fame or recognition. He simply wanted to do his job well, to serve with honor, and to live a quiet life. Now strangers around the world knew his name, his face, and details about his military service that he preferred to keep private. The next morning, Thomas was called to a meeting with Captain Williams and 2 senior officers from the Palace Security Administration. He sat nervously in the conference room, wondering if he was in trouble for speaking during the confrontation. Captain Williams smiled reassuringly. "Mitchell, you're not here because you did anything wrong. We want to discuss how to handle the media attention this incident has generated." One of the senior officers, Colonel Harrison, leaned forward. "The palace has received hundreds of media requests for interviews with you. The public is very interested in your story, particularly your military background and your perspective on the confrontation." Thomas shifted in his chair. "Sir, I'm not interested in being interviewed. I just want to return to my duties." Colonel Harrison nodded. "We respect that, and will handle the media accordingly. However, you should be prepared for continued attention. This story has touched on several sensitive issues: police conduct, military service, tradition versus modernity. People are going to keep talking about it." Meanwhile, Derek was facing his own meeting at the police station. Sergeant Cooper sat across from him, along with 2 internal affairs investigators. The atmosphere was formal and serious. "Officer Hayes, we need to discuss the incident at Buckingham Palace and the subsequent media coverage." One of the investigators began. "You're aware that several complaints have been filed against you over the past year. This latest incident, combined with the public attention it's received, has prompted a formal review of your conduct." Derek felt his career slipping away. The guard's situation was a misunderstanding. "I apologized. What more do you want from me?" The second investigator opened a file. "We want to understand why these incidents keep happening. You're a capable officer in many ways. Your arrest record is solid. Your knowledge of law and procedure is excellent. But you have a pattern of confrontational behavior that concerns us," Sergeant Cooper added. "Derek, I've tried to mentor you to help you see that being a good officer isn't just about asserting authority. It's about knowing when to use authority and when to use judgment. You have the skills to be excellent at this job, but you need to work on your temperament." Derek wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he was just trying to do his job in a world that made it increasingly difficult. But as he sat there, listening to the evidence of his repeated mistakes, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe everyone else was not wrong. Maybe the problem was him. The investigation would take weeks. During that time, Derek was assigned to desk duty, handling paperwork and administrative tasks while the review was conducted. It was humiliating for someone who had joined the force to be out on the streets, making a difference. Now, he was stuck inside. Filing reports and answering phones, Thomas returned to his duties at the palace, but the experience had changed him. He found himself more aware of the public watching him, more conscious of every movement and expression. The job that had once felt natural now felt performative. He wondered if he would ever feel the same peace in his role that he had before. The story continued to spread. News programs debated the incident. Opinion writers used it as an example to support various arguments about respect, authority, tradition, and social change. Neither Thomas nor Derek had wanted this attention, but they had become symbols for larger discussions they had never intended to represent. What neither of them knew was that Marcus Thompson, the young man who had filed the complaint against Derek months earlier, had been following the story closely, and he was about to make a decision that would bring everything full circle. Marcus Thompson sat in his bedroom, scrolling through the videos of Derek Hayes confronting the Royal Guard. Each time he watched, he felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. He remembered his own encounter with Officer Hayes. The way Derek had grabbed his arm during a traffic stop, the aggressive tone, the sense that he was looking for a reason to escalate the situation. Marcus had been driving home from his night shift at the hospital where he worked as a nurse. His taillight was out, a fact he had not noticed. Derek pulled him over, and what should have been a simple warning turned into something much worse. Derek had asked him to step out of the car, then questioned why he seemed nervous. Marcus had tried to explain he was just tired from work, but Derek had interpreted his exhaustion as suspicious behavior. The situation had escalated when Marcus reached for his phone to call his girlfriend. Derek had grabbed his wrist, twisting it painfully, and pushed him against the car. Other officers had arrived and de-escalated the situation, but Marcus's wrist had been bruised for weeks. He filed a complaint, but nothing seemed to come of it. The department investigated. Derek received some internal discipline, but there was no public accountability. Now, watching the Palace incident, Marcus saw an opportunity. He contacted Sarah Jenkins, the journalist who had written about Derek's history of complaints. He offered to go on record with his story, to put a face and name to the pattern of behavior that the article had described. Sarah met with Marcus at a coffee shop the next day. She listened as he described his encounter with Derek, showing her photos of his bruised wrist and the police report from that night. She could see the genuine hurt in his eyes, not just physical pain, but the emotional wound of being treated as a threat when he had done nothing wrong.
Ow.
"Why are you willing to speak publicly now?" Sarah asked. "You could have done this months ago when you first filed the complaint."
Ow.
Marcus stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Back then, I thought the system would handle it. I believed that if I followed the proper procedures, justice would happen. But it didn't. And now I see Officer Hayes doing the same thing to someone else, disrespecting a soldier who has served his country just because he could. If I don't speak up now, when will I?" Sarah published the interview 2 days later. Marcus's story, complete with his photo and full account of what had happened, appeared on the front page of the local news website. The headline read, "I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of Officer Hayes' aggression." The article changed the conversation. It was no longer about one incident at the palace or abstract concerns about police conduct. It was about a real person with a real story, someone who had done nothing wrong but had been treated like a criminal. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Derek read the article in his apartment, his hands shaking. He remembered that night with Marcus Thompson. He had convinced himself at the time that he was just being cautious, that Marcus had seemed suspicious. But reading Marcus's perspective, seeing the photo of the bruised wrist, Derek could not deny the truth anymore. He had been wrong. He had let his need to control the situation override his judgment. For the first time since joining the police force, Derek allowed himself to truly question his behavior. Not just the Palace incident or the Marcus Thompson stop, but all the times he had been aggressive when patience would have worked better. All the times he had demanded respect instead of earning it. All the times he had prioritized his authority over people's dignity. The internal affairs investigation concluded a week later. Derek was called into the office of Chief Inspector Patricia Morrison, the head of his division. She was known for being fair but strict, someone who expected the highest standards from her officers. "Officer Hayes, the investigation has concluded," Chief Inspector Morrison began, her expression serious. "We found that your behavior during the Palace incident, while not criminal, showed poor judgment and a lack of understanding of proper interagency protocols. Combined with your previous complaints and the pattern of behavior they reveal, we have serious concerns." Derek felt his throat tighten. "What does that mean for my career?" Chief Inspector Morrison leaned back in her chair. "You're being suspended for 3 months without pay. During that time, you'll be required to complete an intensive training program on de-escalation. cultural sensitivity, and community policing. You'll also be required to undergo regular counseling sessions to address the underlying issues that contribute to your confrontational behavior. Derek wanted to protest, to argue that the punishment was too severe, but he stopped himself. He thought about Thomas Mitchell standing at his post, about Marcus Thompson just trying to drive home from work, about all the times he had made situations worse instead of better. Maybe this suspension was not punishment. Maybe it was an opportunity. I understand, Derek said quietly. And for what it's worth, I know I've been wrong. I want to do better. Chief Inspector Morrison's expression softened slightly. I hope you mean that, Hayes. You have potential to be a good officer. But you need to learn that the uniform doesn't make you better than anyone else. It gives you responsibility, not superiority. Thomas heard about Marcus Thompson's story through the news like everyone else. He found himself thinking about the young nurse, about how a simple traffic stop had turned into a traumatic experience. Thomas understood trauma. He had seen it in war, in the faces of soldiers and civilians caught in violence they never chose. He realized that trauma did not only come from combat, it could come from anyone who abused their power, even in small ways. One evening, Thomas made an unexpected decision. He found Marcus Thompson's contact information through the hospital where he worked, and sent him a message asking if they could meet. Marcus agreed, curious about why the Royal Guard wanted to talk to him. They met at a quiet pub away from the city center. Thomas arrived in civilian clothes, looking much younger and more ordinary than he did in his ceremonial uniform. Marcus was surprised by how normal he seemed, how approachable. "Thank you for meeting me," Thomas began after they ordered drinks. "I wanted to talk to you because I feel like our experiences with Officer Hayes are connected in a strange way." Marcus nodded. "I've thought the same thing. He treated both of us like we were less than him. With me, it was because I was a black man driving a nice car at night. With you, it was because he saw your silence as disrespect to his authority." Thomas had not thought about the racial dimension of Marcus's experience, but hearing it stated so plainly made him uncomfortable in a way that felt important. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. What I experienced was humiliating, but I wasn't in danger." "You were?" Marcus appreciated the acknowledgement. It's not a competition of who suffered more. The point is that Officer Hayes has a problem with how he sees other people. He needs to be the one in control, the one with power. And anyone who challenges that, even accidentally, becomes a threat to him. They talked for over an hour, sharing their stories, finding common ground in their frustration with how the situation had been handled. By the end of the conversation, they had exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. As news of their meeting spread, people were surprised. The Royal Guard and the nurse, who had both been wronged by the same officer, coming together not in anger, but in understanding. It became another layer to a story that had already captured public attention. Derek, sitting alone in his apartment during his suspension, saw the news about Thomas and Marcus's meeting. He felt a complex mixture of emotions, shame at being the villain in their stories, resentment at being publicly condemned, but also something else. Respect. These two men had every right to hate him, to want revenge, to make his life more difficult. Instead, they were using their experiences to promote understanding and change. The 3 months of suspension. Stretched ahead of Derek, he began his mandated training. Reluctantly at first, but gradually with more genuine engagement. The counseling sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront insecurities he had buried for years. His need for recognition, his fear of being overlooked, his tendency to see interactions as power struggles rather than human connections. One afternoon, sitting in his counselor's office, Derek finally broke down. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the officer I thought I would be when I joined the force." His counselor, Dr. Elizabeth Kumar, spoke gently. "You're already taking the first step by acknowledging that you need to change." The Derek Hayes who confronted that guard at the palace wouldn't have said what you just said. That's progress. As the weeks passed, the intense media attention began to fade. New stories captured public interest. But for Thomas, Derek, and Marcus, the effects of that day at the palace would last much longer. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Buckingham Palace. The viral videos had been buried under newer content. The heated debates had moved on to other controversies, and life had slowly returned to a kind of normal for everyone involved. But none of them were quite the same people they had been that Tuesday morning. Thomas Mitchell stood at his post outside the palace, his posture as perfect as ever, his expression neutral. But internally, he had changed. He understood now that his duty was not just about following orders or maintaining tradition. It was about representing something bigger, about showing dignity under pressure, about being part of a larger story of service. The incident had given him a deeper appreciation for his role and a stronger sense of purpose. He had also become something of an unofficial advocate for mental health support for soldiers and veterans. After the palace incident, several fellow guards had approached him privately, sharing their own struggles with the pressure of their role, with past trauma from deployments, with feeling like they could not show weakness. Thomas started organizing informal support meetings and eventually worked with Captain Williams to establish a more formal peer support program. His experience being thrust into public attention had taught him that vulnerability could be a strength, not a weakness. Marcus Thompson continued his work as a nurse, but he had also become involved in community policing reform efforts. He joined a local oversight board that reviewed police conduct complaints. He spoke at community meetings about his experience and about the importance of accountability and mutual respect between officers and citizens. It was not work he had ever planned to do, but his encounter with Derek Hayes had given him a platform and a purpose he had not expected. Marcus and Thomas had stayed in touch, meeting for coffee every few weeks. Their friendship was unexpected but genuine. They came from different worlds. One, a working-class nurse in the public health system. The other, a soldier from a military family. But they shared an understanding of what it meant to serve others, to face difficult situations with professionalism, to maintain dignity when challenged. Derek Hayes was in the final week of his suspension. The 3 months had been the hardest of his life. The financial stress of unpaid leave had been difficult, but the emotional and psychological work had been even harder. His counseling sessions with Dr. Kumar had forced him to confront truths about himself he had spent years avoiding. He had come to understand that his aggressive behavior stemmed from deep insecurity. He had always felt he needed to prove himself, to show he was tough enough, smart enough, worthy enough. That need had driven him to see every interaction as a test he had to win. It had made him a difficult colleague, an aggressive officer, and ultimately, someone who hurt people unnecessarily. The training courses he was required to complete had opened his eyes to different approaches to policing. He learned about de-escalation techniques, about cultural competency, about the importance of building trust in communities rather than demanding compliance through force. He realized that the officers he most admired, like Sergeant Cooper, were effective not because they were aggressive, but because they were wise. On the last day of his suspension, Derek made a decision. He called Sarah Jenkins, the journalist whose article had exposed his history of complaints. She was surprised to hear from him, but agreed to meet. They sat in the same coffee shop where she had interviewed Marcus Thompson months earlier. Derek looked different, more humble, less certain of himself in a way that seemed healthier. "Wanted to thank you," Derek began, the words clearly difficult for him. "Your article destroyed my reputation, cost me 3 months of pay, and made my life miserable. But it also forced me to face things I needed to face. I was angry at you for a long time, but I realize now that you were just doing your job. And more importantly, you were holding me accountable in a way the system had failed to do." Sarah studied him carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but she saw genuine change in his eyes. "What are you going to do when you return to duty?" Derek exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I even want to return to regular patrol work. I've been thinking about other ways to serve. Maybe working with youth programs or community outreach. Something where I can build relationships instead of just enforcing rules." They talked for nearly an hour. Sarah found herself impressed by Derek's willingness to be vulnerable, to admit his mistakes, to genuinely seek to do better. Before they parted, she asked if he would be willing to do a follow-up interview about his journey over the past 6 months. Derek agreed. The interview was published 2 weeks later. It was titled Officer Hayes Speaks, A Journey from Confrontation to Understanding. In it, Derek spoke candidly about his mistakes, his insecurities, and his efforts to change. He apologized publicly to Thomas Mitchell and Marcus Thompson. He acknowledged that he had abused his authority and failed to live up to the standards his uniform represented. The response was mixed. Some people applauded his honesty and growth. Others were skeptical, viewing it as a public relations effort to save his career. But for those who knew the full story, including Thomas and Marcus, the interview represented genuine progress. Marcus read the interview and felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, because the hurt of what had happened still lingered, but something close to hope. If Derek could change, if he could acknowledge his mistakes and work to be better, maybe the system could change too. Maybe officers could learn to see citizens as people to protect rather than problems to control. Thomas saw the interview during a break from his duties. He felt a similar, cautious optimism. He thought about sending Derek a message, but decided against it. Some wounds healed with time and distance, not with forced reconciliation. But he did feel that the circle had closed in some way, that the chaos of that confrontation had led to something meaningful for everyone involved. A month after returning to duty, Derek requested a transfer to the Community Policing Division. His request was granted with the condition that he would work under close supervision for the first year. He was assigned to work with youth outreach programs in diverse neighborhoods, building relationships with families and young people who often viewed police with suspicion or fear. It was humbling work. Many people recognized him from the viral videos. Some confronted him directly about his past behavior. But Derek took each interaction as an opportunity to show that he had changed, to prove through actions rather than words that he was committed to being a better officer and a better person. One afternoon, Derek was working at a community center when Marcus Thompson walked in. They both froze, seeing each other for the first time since that night of the traffic stop. The room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus spoke first. "Officer Hayes, I heard you were working in this area now." Derek stood, his hands trembling slightly. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. Not just because it's the right thing to say, but because I genuinely am sorry for how I treated you. You were just trying to go home after work, and I made that into something threatening because of my own issues. There's no excuse for it." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. He could see the change in Derek's posture in his eyes, in the way he carried himself. This was not the aggressive officer who had grabbed his wrist that night. This was someone who had done the hard work of confronting his own demons. "I appreciate you saying that," Marcus replied. "I don't know if I'm ready to say we're okay, but I can see you're trying, and that matters." They shook hands, a simple gesture that felt monumental given their history. It was not a Hollywood ending with instant forgiveness and newfound friendship, but it was real, honest, and human. As the months continued to pass, the three men's lives moved forward. Thomas received a commendation for his work establishing the peer support program for guards. He was featured in a military magazine article about mental health initiatives, speaking about the importance of soldiers supporting each other. Marcus was appointed to a city council subcommittee on police reform, using his experience and his nursing background to advocate for crisis intervention, training, and mental health resources for both officers and communities. Derek continued his community policing work, slowly rebuilding his reputation through consistent, respectful engagement. He would never be the officer he had imagined becoming when he first joined the force, the decorated detective or the respected supervisor, but he was becoming something perhaps more valuable, an officer who genuinely understood the communities he served and who approached his work with humility instead of ego. On the one-year anniversary of the Palace confrontation, a small ceremony was held at the community center where Derek worked. It was attended by local residents, police officers, and community leaders. To Derek's surprise, both Thomas Mitchell and Marcus Thompson attended. The ceremony was about recognizing community members who had contributed to positive police-community relationships. Derek was not receiving an award, he was helping organize the event. But seeing Thomas and Marcus there, supporting the work he was trying to do, felt more meaningful than any commendation could have been. After the ceremony, the three men stood together awkwardly, unsure what to say. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "It's strange how life works out. A moment of chaos leading to all of this." Marcus nodded. "We could have all just walked away angry, let it destroy us in different ways. But we chose to turn it into something better." Derek looked at both of them with genuine gratitude. "I don't deserve your presence here, or your willingness to even speak to me. But I want you both to know that you've changed my life. You forced me to become someone better." They did not become close friends. The hurt was too deep, the history too complicated. But they had found a way to exist in the same world with mutual respect and understanding. And perhaps that was enough. The videos of the palace confrontation still existed online, viewed occasionally by people discovering the story for the first time. But the real story was not captured in those viral moments. The real story was in the months and years that followed. In the difficult work of change and growth, in the choice to turn conflict into understanding. That story would never go viral, but it was the one that mattered most.